don't be afraid to make mistakes, but also understand that a big part of how I see learning is usually unlearning. And so the learning is questioning any sort of existing beliefs that you might have.
The inclusion part is that a person feels like they can bring all of those different parts of their identity to work with them as much as they want to and feel comfortable with.
My quick piece of advice that I would recommend people do is really remember that diversity and inclusion, or DEI, or people and culture, whatever my job is called in 5 years time, it's a learning journey. My name is Alyssa Ordu. A little bit about me: I am a bit of a long-winded title, bear with me, a marketing, diversity and inclusion consultant. I came to be that because I've been spending the bulk of the last 10 years working in tech, and in the beginning a lot of it was in marketing and in product. And one of the things that I noticed with a lot of the companies and startups and scale-ups I was working with, I was oftentimes the only person of color, oftentimes also the only woman.
My day job is I've got one longer than you, corporate communications and public affairs manager at, yeah, it's long, at an independent academic publisher where I co-founded the BAME and LGBTQIA+ employee groups there. And since then, I've been heavily involved with their diversity and inclusion work, advising, helping with the training and education, creating spaces for conversations within the company.
My name is Jack Williams, my pronouns are he, him. So my job title, it's not a long one. I'm an inclusion and diversity advisor at Bryan Cave Leighton Paisner, BCLP, which is a law firm, global. I've worked for about 6.5 years now within inclusion and diversity. So I've worked across a whole different range of sectors, from law, financial services, professional services, also public sector, local government, charity sector as well. All across a whole different range of themes, topics, sections of diversity and inclusion, but all really centred around supporting organisations to become more inclusive workplaces.
Thank you very much. So you can obviously see I'm very excited to have this conversation today. So the first thing, I guess, I thought I wanted to maybe set the tone in terms of what we'll be discussing today, because obviously this is a diversity and inclusion panel, but with a focus on Pride in particular. And I know it was meant to kind of take place in Pride Month, and it's taking place now, but actually it's kind of worked out for the best, because I think I think we've discussed this in the briefing, it's like a pet peeve of mine has always been that a lot of activities go on Pride and then Pride Month, and then after that doesn't get followed through. So I'm actually really happy to be having this conversation now, and hopefully it's the start of something that could help our client base, our own employees, our own management as well, to really become kind of more inclusive, etc. But also so we can, connect with other networks as well, and hopefully can add to that. Just a few things, obviously, we discussed in the briefing around disclaimers. I know I'm speaking with the very best in terms of expertise academically, but also within corporate. However, I think it's just to, make sure that everybody knows it's a safe space when it comes to terminology, when it comes to the right things to say, etc. This is a conversation where I think a lot of people, because of wanting to get things right all the time, might feel like they don't want to say certain things or use certain terms. So just kind of setting the tone, this is a very safe space, and also for anyone watching, we will be using terms like queer, gay, trans, etc., which I know some people feel differently, might identify as queer, but not might want to identify as gay, and vice versa. So I think just to kind of put that out there before starting the panel. Okay, so the first question will be, what does diversity mean to you?
What does diversity and inclusion, or just diversity?
Diversity for now, because we'll delve into inclusion later.
Okay, so I think for me, there's two ways to look at what diversity is. And often when we hear the term diversity, our mind will instantly jump to what I describe as protected characteristics, so things within the UK Equality Act like sexuality, gender identity, race and ethnicity, disability, etc. And I think a lot of organisations are looking at diversity from that angle, which is very important because, as we know, there are specific and sometimes very significant barriers to participation that people from those backgrounds face. But for me, the second part that sometimes I think is missing is diversity beyond that. So things like diversity of thought, diversity of experience, diversity of background, diversity of ideas, and so on. And that's one of the key things that you need to make good teams, to make a good company, to produce the best outputs. But what's important is that those two things for me very much go hand in hand. Of course, if you have diversity of identity, you're much more likely to have diversity of background and experience because naturally everyone's going to have very different experiences. Of course, if you put 5 people in a room who all look the same, sure, their experiences will vary slightly, but it will be much different if everyone is coming from different places. So I think for me, it's those two areas: diversity of identity, where we most often think, but then also diversity of thought and experience, which is the important bit.
Thank you. And Lina, would you like to add a bit more onto that?
Sure. So the way I see it is that a lack of diversity is sort of a singular universal viewpoint. And so I think we have a basic understanding that the world as it currently sits is built and is sort of understood through the framework of what is essentially a straight, able-bodied white man. And so diversity is a way to understand the world, how it treats and affects people that don't belong into these categories, and that to unpick how what we consider to be universal rights, universal dignities, universal access to things is very much tied to a lot of social categories that we often overlook and just sort of pin down to personal sort of discriminations and psychological bias. So yeah, diversity for me is looking at the ways socially we've been categorized in a manner that doesn't allow for equality.
And Alyssa?
Gosh, how does one follow on from that? If I had a mic, I would drop it. Yeah, just building on what you said, Lina, and you said, Jack, I couldn't agree more. I guess if there's one thing I can maybe attempt to add to that is, for me, I think sometimes we bind the words like diversity and inclusion, as like in many of our job titles, right? We bind them together, or diversity, inclusion, and belonging. But for me, they're not necessarily mutually inclusive. So there's one saying, and this might sound a little bit cliche, but it's a bit like some of you might have heard of it. But who gets invited to have a seat at the table, right? And then like once you're at the table, who gets to be served the meal, who gets to speak and be heard and not spoken over, who gets invited back, or as my friends in Hawaii say, who gets invited to the luau. And I think that for me kind of articulates in maybe a reductionist, but a simple terms, and I think simple metaphors can sometimes be how we can make this work be understood outside of some of our academic environments, is that, yeah, diversity and inclusion and belonging aren't necessarily the same thing. And I think it is very important for us to have more and diverse voices in the room. And as Jack mentioned, that kind of going beyond like a racial and a gendered line, or sexuality line, for example, that's really, really important. And there are specific experiences and significant barriers that we face in terms of protected characteristics as well. But looking beyond that as well in terms of, also personality traits. For example, I notice this a lot I do a lot of work, as I've said, in tech at the likes of, Amazon, Sky, Airbnb, a lot of these kind of household name, big scale ups, and which are now pretty corporate actually, a lot of the time. And I find that, there's a lot of people that are very, very, very introverted, particularly in product teams, particularly in engineering teams. So it's like you have that bit of a double burden sometimes where it's not just, who's getting to be in these teams and do we have female and Black and queer developers, but also in terms of personality traits. Are people used to even holding space and speaking up in the first place? Who do we feel comfortable with carrying certain conversations? So that for me is something that a space I try to play with. It's not devaluing and not assuming these things are the same, whether it's diversity or inclusion or belonging, and kind of feeling like you can show up as your full self and be authentic and not be penalized in relation to the thing where you diverge from the norm or the framework that Lina so neatly packaged for us of, you know, that white, straight, able-bodied male experience that so many of us even in this room, haven't experienced ourselves.
Yeah, absolutely. I was just going to add to that as well, to all of your points, which are absolutely amazing in terms of just from experience. This is why I kind of split this question into two, to discuss diversity first and then kind of delve into inclusion. So this is an amazing segue. Thank you so much, Alyssa. It works really well. The only thing I was going to add, like on diversity, what I've noticed is, like, especially when we do a lot of client work, they're like, oh, I want to focus on gender diversity, or I want to focus on neurodiversity, or I want to focus on sexuality. And I think we tend to then put people in boxes and forget about the intersectionality, and that you can be all of those things, and that's okay, and that's welcome, and you can be yourself. So I guess before going into the inclusion, I just wanted to, because I think it's really important as well to understand that from that perspective when talking about inclusion, because it's not just about like, I get asked a lot, right? I get asked, how do we improve our gender diversity? Because I work in tech, right? So majority do identify as male. Yeah, so, you know, I'm always looking at, okay, well, what's your ethnicity makeup in the teams also? You know, what's your neurodiversity like? Like, let's talk about these conversations, because it's not just about finding, you know, white women to then put into places and completely forgetting about, you know, the large ethnic and Black minority that the Black and ethnic minority that we have in London as an example. So yeah, so thank you for that. And just on that, I guess, so my next question would be, why is workplace inclusion important? And I guess we talked about the diversity element and how we need that to reflect kind of, you know, the marginalized communities, as well as people of different genders and people of different sexualities. But at the same time, you know, like you said, Alyssa, it's not the done deal. Inclusion is a massive part of that. So I guess, why is that important, and why is it important to not only do the diversity work, but to put a lot into the inclusion work as well?
I think for me, what you said there, Tasneem, about the intersectionality piece is what comes in here. For me, the inclusion part is that a person feels like they can bring all of those different parts of their identity to work with them as much as they want to and feel comfortable with. You know, it's all well and good to do the diversity bit. Okay, so we're hiring, you know, 50% women, we're hiring 50% Black people, and so on. But if there's no inclusion, if your workplace isn't a positive place for them, they're all going to leave in 6 months, and then you're in exactly the same place, except you just lost loads of money on really, really rubbish recruitment process. So the inclusion part is so much more critical than the diversity. I think sometimes I see organizations wonder, it's a bit chicken and egg. Do we try to hire more diverse people, or do we try to make a more inclusive workplace? Which one do we do first? I mean, ideally you should be doing both, but I think the inclusion part is so critical, because actually if you're creating and developing a workplace where people feel valued, people feel like they can be themselves, actually you are naturally going to attract a more diverse group of people applying for the jobs, wanting to work there, spreading stories about their experiences.
Oh, absolutely. There was one thing, actually, I'm going to make you repeat, Jack, because it really resonated when you said last time, when we were prepping for the session. And it was about what society is ready for and what it is accepting of, right? Because when you're talking about, I think this is really important when talking about intersectionality, because you said something about society being ready for a white, cis, queer man more than anything. I just want to bring this point into the session, because I think inclusion is very much about not being, like you said, Alyssa, not just being on the table, but what you bring, like, you know, who can speak, right? And who will be heard and who will be listened. And also, Jack, as well, to your point, people will leave if it's not inclusive. But I think also a lot of people stay, but they stay because their jobs are important to them, but they don't feel, and this is something that I probably had experience with myself, being of different ethnicity, and kind of sitting in rooms where I'm really kind of trying to prove myself, etc. But then I don't feel included. No one's kind of passing the mic to hear what I've got to say, etc. So just going back to, I'm just going to push back, and not push back, but I'm just going to just delve in a little bit deeper into what you said there.
I'm trying to remember exactly what I said now. When you said that, I thought, oh, I said something really good and I didn't write it down. Yeah, I mean, so it's all well and good to have the structure.
I'll remind you of what you said.
Yeah, I remember. I think it's well and good to have, you know, the structure in place to support inclusion, but also there's two parts of it. Do you have, you know, the policies in place that are leading towards an inclusive workplace, but it's not just enough to have that. You also have to have an inclusive culture where actually, if someone wanted to come in, you know, presenting gender non-conforming, if a man wanted to come in wearing a skirt and heels, sure, you might have a policy in place that says, yes, per our dress code policy, that's okay. But if everyone in the office is like staring at him and being like, oh, what's going on? This is very weird.
Yeah.
He's going to feel really uncomfortable and not want to do it. So there's those two parts of it, you know. It's very multifaceted. It would be great if it was simple, but it is very multifaceted. And
Lina, I'm just going to pick your brains actually on from an academic or from like a thought type perspective. Just wondering, with inclusion, because we know historically all these institutions and big corporates obviously follow. They're all built on like colonial systems that aren't really made for spaces of people of color. They're not really made for heterosexuals. And sorry, no, they are. They're made for heterosexuals. They're not made for non or people who don't identify as. So can we really, I mean, and it's interesting, Jack, to your point about policy versus culture. And I think we need to do both, but, you know, maybe if we can just touch upon like the systematic side of things and the policy side and where that actually comes from and being aware of that existing in the first place.
Definitely. So I'm just going to touch on a few things.
Yeah.
That initially it was just like that idea of like thinking about things intersectionally and, you know, not just trying to get more women in or more white gay men in. This is why I think of the framework of just, again, the straight white able-bodied white man, because it's, you know, in a lot of theorizing now around race and around sexuality, it's like we need to stop hyperfixating on blackness and on queerness. Let's look at whiteness. Let's look at, you know, the heteronormative way of thinking about the world. Let's look at the patriarchy. This is what needs to be studied, because I personally also love the table analogy. And so what I end up being interested in is not just who's getting invited to the table, but who designed the table to begin with. Because whoever designed it is going to design it in a way that's beneficial for the people that get to sit at it. And so when we start then talking about diversity may get me to the table, but inclusion is going to let me say stuff about the table if I don't like it. Because the idea is that once you get invited, you're going to be grateful and happy. But I've been invited knowing full well this was never a system that was meant for me. So you're going to allow some exceptions to come through to make you look like you're diverse, but you are not going to then try to truly create an inclusive and you know, fully belonging system, because the radical notion would be, let's flip the whole table. This thing is broken. It's built on colonialism. It's built on slavery. It's built on some of the worst concepts to ever come out of sort of like human thinking in general. And so this is, I think, where corporations will start to struggle a little bit, is because it's not just about who you're allowing into the room and who on the table. You need to be changing your relationship with the table itself. It's like, okay, this has been serving me, but I know it's harmful for other people. So you might have to let go from certain things that you have provided you a lot of security, have provided you with a lot of success. But now it's this idea of like, we all have to sit at it. So you have to take everybody into consideration. It's like having a dinner party and having one dish and just assuming everybody's going to eat it without like asking about intolerances or whatever. You know what I mean? Like it simply doesn't work that way. And so I am very much interested in the material effects of these kinds of things. Of like, if you want to take on this work, you are not going to be able to get into people's brains and unpick all of their unconscious biases. I mean, we've sort of been having these conversations for a few decades now, and we know that's slow because like Jack said, you can change policy, you can even change law. It doesn't change how people, you know, treat each other and how people don't get promoted and how all of these things. And so what you effectively need is a few people that hold these positions of power in corporations and states in whatever sort of vicinity that you can affect change within, and be willing to make some very hard decisions of like, I'm going to have to give up some of what I have to give to other people. I don't know if that sort of like answered it, but this is how I sort of like view the systemic nature of it, that it's all sort of like built on each other. And if you interrogate it down to a point where you understand the core is rotten, it also shouldn't make you feel like sort of really dejected, because people will get to this stage, realize how bad and systematic it is, and sort of give up and get like, it's like, you know what, this is pointless. It's everywhere. How can I possibly fight it? You can. Incremental changes in your immediate surroundings and then the people that you know. That's also really important work.
Dropping all the gems. There's so many things that said that I want to comment on, but I'll just kind of pull on a couple things which I think there's like almost like a invisible golden thread being woven between the tapestries, which is like, oh yeah, this is all connected. And part of the thing itself, the thing around our collective necks. But to your point about, to your various points about the, you know, where diversity and inclusion and belonging converge and divulge as well. I think Jack said something about, you know, what happens in, you say you do focus on the diversity piece and you get women and queers or Black queers, Black women, whatever, you know, in the room. But then what happens in 6 months' time if the culture doesn't necessarily support them, you know, then don't be surprised when we have this mass exodus, right? And people leave. I think this is a piece that we don't always, and to your point, Lina, about the asking ourselves the hard questions and making the hard decisions, we don't always like critically engage with our own like praxis, right? Putting our theory in practice and like what pedagogies we're leveraging. Sometimes these things are happening and it's not always rocket science, but we're not trying to like learn from our mistakes, because this is something that I see a lot in teams. Like sometimes you do get a bit more diversity, and especially lower down the chain, right? Lower down the ladder. But it's a bit like that saying, you know, if you can't see here, you can't be here. Like with a pinch of salt, maybe, but it's one thing to get more colorful people or more people from protected characteristics in company period, let alone further down the chain. But if they're not represented in the highest like upper echelons, if we are not able to see people like us who have experienced issues like us, how do we be believed? It's not just, do we feel like we're able to speak up and not be spoken over, but do we feel we're even going to literally be believed, be heard when we do? And I think for me, you know, not to maybe bring in social justice movements, but maybe we were going to get there anyway.
No, please do. Yeah.
But I feel like movements like Me Too and BLM I've been so grateful for. And I hope they spearhead many more like movements like them. But I find that my biggest learning from those two movements has really been, just for me as subjective personal level, is that we don't believe everyone. Right? Some people, some communities have to get so hurt and get so loud for so long for us to say, oh, you know what, maybe that is what's going on with you. And maybe this isn't an isolated anecdote. Maybe this is more than a few bad apples. Maybe this is a systematic thing. So I think when we're talking about whether it's the business case for diversity or it being the right thing to do, I think we would do well to heed Jack's advice and not forget the inclusion and the belonging piece, because otherwise, we're sacrificing things like retention and things like promotion. And I know that whatever sector we're in, whether we're in publishing or law or tech, that the more of the world that is represented in our teams, and crucially at the executive, at the utmost level, at the drawing board, the better able to design for inclusion we are, whether that's the designing of tableware or the products that we're going to be launching, or the communications and creative campaigns around those products. There's so many books, I feel like, that are coming out about this. Invisible Women, you know, all these things, realizing that we're not always designing the world for people that aren't necessarily in the dominant group. And the more able to do that we are, the more able to deserve our diverse clientele we are. And if we don't have diverse clientele yet, then the more we'll educate people to join us. So I think that's like important for us to recognize the value of it strategically. That's how we're going to be able to better communicate globally for those of us that want to do that as well. When we kind of have people in the room already. So it's not like an aftermath thing, or by the time a campaign's gone live and we're like, oh gosh, that's not PC. And you know, you find out too late that you're testing in production. People, get the diversity in, let's focus on the inclusion, focus on the belonging. But yeah, remembering that these things aren't always mutually inclusive.
But belonging as well is such a huge part as well, because just on your point, Lina, as well, giving up, giving up privileges to make space for other people to speak up. And I just want to bring a point, which is, it might be really simplistic, especially for people who've been doing diversity for a long time. But I guess the one thing that I think that comes up is it makes certain people uncomfortable because they're not aware of the pain and suffering of marginalized communities who have never belonged and have constantly suffered, years in terms of not belonging, not feeling heard, not feeling accepted. And so I guess when you're talking to someone who doesn't perhaps understand that, they're like, well, why should I give up my privilege? I haven't done anything. I'm not a racist. I'm inclusive. I've got lots of queer friends, so maybe just if we can just address that and why it's important from an inclusion point of view to tackle this question, because as much as we're having uncomfortable conversations and there's space for that, I don't want people to walk away from this session and think, oh gosh, we're just being criticized, we can't do anything right, etc., etc. So I think maybe if we just kind of continue that conversation of giving up privilege, to your point, Alyssa, as well, about marginalized communities not feeling like they belong, and why it's important for why it's important to give up those privileges, especially someone from a white cis heterosexual background, and what does giving up privileges mean? Because it's not necessarily saying, okay, quit your job like right now, make space, we're going to bring in a load of people from diverse backgrounds. So maybe if we just kind of touch upon that point a little bit more. Nina, I can say you wanted to say something as well, and so maybe we'll go to you first.
Always do. But yeah, to your point about the discomfort, it ends up playing in various ways, and depending on how it plays out, you can sort of respond accordingly. So you have the people that it's like, it's not me, I didn't do it, this doesn't concern me, I don't know why I have to, it's not like I had an easy life, my life was difficult too. Closer, but it wasn't because of the color of your skin. That aside, this is, again, that's what I'm saying. It's like trying to change somebody's relationship to the world or their view of the world, as opposed to like us then playing oppression Olympics of like, please look at our pain, please look at our pain, please look at our pain. It's like, no, let's try and like understand the world in a slightly different way from the way you see it, because other people see it quite differently. And then sort of breaking it down in that way. And, you're going to then get into like, the inheritances and racial inequality of like income and how that plays out over generations and all of these things. And so when it comes to people that are really uncomfortable, what you also end up having a little bit, which is something I'm experiencing at the moment and is very frustrating, is the really holding on to some of the marginalized voices that are kind of okay with the system, like the Pretty Patels of the world. Right? The look, it's not so bad, I didn't get discriminated against, and part of the reason these sort of voices are amplified over millions in front of them saying, like screaming, like please help us, is because it feeds into that sense of comfort. So I've gotten to a stage where it's like, if I'm like confronted with somebody who's really uncomfortable with this and doesn't see like their relation to them personally, I'm no longer going to try and appeal to the humanitarian side of things. So if they are more academically inclined, I can take the social science approach to it. It's like, okay, let's look at this from a research perspective and like, you know, go into the sociology or the psychology, whatever discipline you're into. If they're more business minded, it's like, let's talk about how this is better for your bottom line. It's better for your PR. And I think it's naive to assume that we can get to a stage where we are going to change everybody's mind. And I mean, when they genuinely believe it, like there's a genuine problem and I need to genuinely change it. And so this is why I always bring it back to like the material affect that it has in people's lives, because people will understand that. So if I take myself as an example, I'm in a female majority company, rare thing, right? It's owned and started by a woman, 60% women, senior leadership, 50% women. I mean, the two most senior people are men, but that aside. But the gender pay gap at our company is still at 22%. So we're now back to this concept of like, you know, what happens when you stop at diversity, when you get that visual representation. It's just like, I don't care if this company is 60% women, women are overall still getting paid 22% less. So let's look at numbers. Let's look at figures. Let's look at why, you know, you could have a 50% like POC workforce and they're all interns in your like lowest of quartiles. This is what I'm just like, let's look at numbers. And if somebody is okay when being confronted with that, then this is a different thing. But you know, the discomfort is never going to go away because you are dealing with white guilt, with white fragility. Same applies to men, same applies with straight people, and it goes on and on and on and on. So appealing to somebody's sense of morality and righteousness doesn't always work, but there are so many other arguments for this, and there's so much research to back it up in whatever direction is necessary. But that's part of the thing that makes it exhausting, is that you constantly have to adapt your conversation. And again, to remind a person of like, I'm constantly having to adapt my conversation, by the way, and I'm like, I have to get really creative of how I can get through to you, because what this says is that your worldview is inherently more right or more valuable than mine. And so if somebody says it's like, oh, it's not my problem, it's like, okay, so you've just invalidated my whole experience. So it's just like, whatever it is you're doing, whether I like it or not, is my problem. What white men are doing in my street is my problem. I wish it wasn't, but it is. So, yeah, don't know if that answers it.
No, yeah, perfect. Thank you. I'm just going to pass the mic on to Jack as well, because I appreciate, which is fine, but bringing the white man back into the conversation.
It's fine. I'm gay, so I tick a box. It's fine. Well, actually, I wanted to say I think there's a real life example of some of the stuff that Lina's talking about, and what I'm seeing at the moment. So obviously there's been a pandemic, there's been lockdowns, we've all been working in very different ways. And a lot of people with disabilities have been saying, actually, this has changed my life. You know, I'm much more able to manage my disability or engage with work in different ways. And now, obviously, a lot of companies are talking about returning to the office, what that looks like, hybrid models, all of these things we're talking about. But actually, a lot of those people with disabilities then saying, oh, it would be a much more beneficial for me and also for the company, because I'm going to be better at my work, if I'm able to just continue working as I have been. And therefore, people are then being confronted with this potential need to change their thinking about the workplace and about what it looks like. And of course, that then potentially leads to, and Lina, if I'm misinterpreting some of what you said, just tell me shut.
No, please.
It then leads to them having to potentially give up some of what they thought work was going to be, what the way that, for senior leaders, the way they want to manage and run their organization, or risk losing some of their talent just because they're not allowing them to work in certain ways. So I think, you know, we are being faced with this every day, and it's very, 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 very present in the workplaces, certainly that I'm seeing.
I think as well, Jack, that is a brilliant example in terms of what diversity at the top does. Because I think if you've got people with disabilities who are on board members, who are chairwomen and men on boards, right? When you're talking about the future of work, etc., that conversation will come up. There will be an inclusivity. Someone will actually raise the question of, well, okay, so you want to bring the people back into the office. What happens to the likes of us who work better at home? Where is that conversation? And if there's a lack of diversity on that board, if there's a lack of diversity in the management board, then those conversations are likely to be missed, because you need to then rely on someone who is, educated and just consciously always thinking about this, which isn't always the case, unfortunately. Like, obviously we'd love for everyone to kind of, myself included, I mean, just because I care about certain things around diversity doesn't mean that sometimes I miss the mark on something or that I haven't considered something. So I think this is why representation is so important, and not just kind of, and I think everybody said it on this panel, like not just bringing people in at intern level and then kind of, picking up. There's another thing, I guess, maybe moving the conversation slightly. Lina, you picked up on that before. Social mobility is a big part of what I do within my job, and so I focus on social mobility and then intersectionalities, because within that as well, we're looking at, especially in the UK, I think it's safe to say we live in a very kind of classist system sometimes, and people from disadvantaged backgrounds, regardless of their ethnicity, regardless of their white or they're non-white, if they go to a state school that doesn't have the networks to then get its students onto higher education, and the discrimination within the higher education institutions anyway, in regards to, disparity, but also race and other things. So just be good to maybe get your views on that.
I think one thing I've seen work really well, and I guess it again speaks to that point around having to change your thinking or what you're doing, is I think we saw maybe a couple of years ago now, some large companies, like even some of the big four consulting firms, changing the goalpost and saying, actually, for our graduate roles, we're not going to require a degree anymore. And just changing it a little bit so that actually you're opening the door to people from different backgrounds, from a social mobility perspective. And that doesn't have to be a big thing, but what it does and the message it sends is a recognition that your experience is valuable, whether it's at a university or whether you've done an apprenticeship or whether you've worked since you were 16 or whatever else. And it just it's that little step towards creating a more inclusive workplace, like we've talked about, where people feel like, actually, I'm just as valuable as anyone else in this room, and my experiences matter too. I think that's a great example.
I just wanted to jump in, just if I had like on Reddit, like a +1 upvote button. Yeah. I think that's so true. I think sometimes we forget, especially because we're dealing with such quite dense, like a lot of the topics we're talking about today, like this stuff is heavy, right? Like it's not just theoretical for so many of us, for most of us really, in some way, shape or form. It's our identity, it's our life. It's how we feel able to move through the world and how the world lets us know we can and cannot move through it. So it can feel like, the rucksack. I think there's probably some smart analogy here, which I don't remember, but like putting like the bricks on the rucksack and you're like, by the time you get home, you're like, I can barely carry it. But I think sometimes we forget the power that we have in terms of, and how we can use that. So even just thinking about whether it's in recruitment for the big four and different, positions there, but even in terms of boards as well. Companies sometimes forget that you can change, not just where you're advertising the roles, but also the language that you're using to attract talent in the first place. And something that I've been doing in the last year, I kind of set it as a throw aside comment in this like coaching community. I was doing this course, and I kind of said, oh, wouldn't it be great to black up some boards, like ha 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 lol. But then a year later, actually it was a couple months later, then I found myself under 30, a woman of color. I'm sitting on two charity boards. Big up, yeah. But something that I've noticed was that it wasn't just that I had the qualifications or took the time to put together some jazzy application, but it was also that those two charities specifically said they were looking for and encouraged people like me to apply. So not just people from different racial and gender backgrounds, for example, or different sexual backgrounds, but also one of the primary indicators that enabled my interest and my ability to actually apply and actually be taken seriously, was that they didn't have it as a prerequisite to have been on a board before. Because oftentimes whether it's boards, whether it's that, sweet old C-suite, you know what I'm getting at. We don't realize the hidden code that's there in black and covertly and overtly. But sometimes it's as simple as if you require people to have, 35 years of experience in something, or to have held 5 different board positions before, we're kind of addressing what Lina was saying earlier, with that these things are happening at a systematic level, and that not everyone is getting an equal access and opportunity to these positions in the first place. If the system is already broken, whether that's in relation to our access to higher education, higher leadership in corporates, whatever it is, then we're already limiting the pool. And then what we're saying is that only people that look a certain way can do that job, can hold that position. And if that's not what we believe, then we have to look at what barriers we are upholding that are making that be inevitable. So I just wanted to say that as an encouragement, piece of advice maybe for anybody watching that is rethinking about their C-suite or rethinking about the setup of their board. Remember how much power you have in the communication of it. If you really want to attract a wider range of people across ages, sexes, locations, classes, or whatever it is that you're trying to optimize for, do that. Say that, and then by all means do it and back it up. Because then you will get people like us, people like me, applying to these positions. And the more you have them, the more contagious it is. I'll just have one final anecdote on that. I noticed that within 3 months of me joining one of the charities, they hired 2 more people of color, one of whom is also gay. I don't know that that's a coincidence.
When I first joined, the prerequisite for a graduate program for training was predominantly focused actually on graduates and graduates with certain degrees. And I just scrapped that because I was just like, no, I don't want to have people from computer science degrees. I'm sorry, I couldn't care less. Like, don't care. Yes, they'll have the relevant experience. Yes, a lot of our intakes still come from comp sci, but it's not a prerequisite. A lot of them actually, we've opened it up a lot. They come from music degrees, they come from languages degrees. You're coding in a language, right? So all of these things are transferable, and we can train people up. So we've got school leavers as well, because again, like, you could go to university and you can study something, and then all of a sudden you have to code in Java for your job and you've never done it. So you have to be trained on it anyway. So then what is the point of saying, oh no, you can only learn Java if you've done like 3 years at Cambridge and you've done all this? Like, it's like, no, that's not. So, and again, like the last 2 cohorts has been, 50-50 gender split. And within that as well, got 60% Black. Some come from other ethnic minorities as well. So it's not a coincidence. It really isn't. When you open it up, it's not, there's no secret ingredient or someone has cracked the code to like diversity. And still, I think it's really important as well, like, not to give yourself as a company, not to give yourself a pat on the back, because diversity is like the first step, right? Inclusion is the bit where, like, and that's what you said, Lina, as well, like, let's talk numbers. I want to see how many of those get promoted, how many of them are going to get pay rises. Are the people that identify as women versus men in 5 years' time, are they going to be getting paid the same? Like, these are the stats that I want to know, because if we hired 50-50 gender split in this cohort, and then in 5 years' time, they're with us, but the men are getting paid 20% more, then we have failed. Like, we have not done it. All we've done is just increase the disparities in the workplace, So that is really important. And the other thing as well, which I think, Alyssa, it just brings what you said, it brings us back onto the question as well, in terms of, what advice would you have to companies? And I know we've discussed it, but if we had to I don't know, like, summarize in terms of like a 101 how to do it, I've got a couple of things I'd like to maybe touch on. So the language bit, Alyssa, that you've mentioned is really, really important, because one thing I wanted us to maybe just talk about as well is, in terms of language, understanding, for example, especially sexuality or disabilities, right? They don't have to be visible. Like, it's not about everyone having to declare that they have an illness if it's not visible, or if somebody, identifies as bi or gay. Like, so what? Their language is really important. It's making sure that they're in an environment where they feel safe. They don't owe people coming out to them or declaring anything, but still feeling included, because no one is saying offensive or derogatory terms in the office. So that's one thing. And the other thing as well I wanted to touch upon is budget. So please feel free. I'm open in this space to discuss all.
But my one piece of advice, I think, to the first half of your question, and what would we advise? My quick piece of advice that I would recommend people do is really, really, really remember that diversity and inclusion, or DEI, or people in culture, whatever my job is called in 5 years time, it's a learning journey, right? We're all on different stages of that learning journey. Might sound cheesy, but I always say I do a lot of workshops, and I always say there's no such thing as a stupid question, only an unasked one. And I really hope that people feel safe and brave to respect that people are coming at this with different, lived experiences and different struggles that we ourselves may not share, but that doesn't make it invalid. And I think that we sometimes have to there's a lot to be said for being kind to each other, but also to ourselves. And part of being on a learning journey means that you might fail, right? The only way we never fail is if we never try. And that's the opposite of learning. So I really hope that people try to do that more, because I think oftentimes, as whether we're individual consultants or businesses, people feel so afraid in this cancel culture climate we seem to have found ourselves in, of saying the wrong thing. And that sometimes limits them to the point that they then say nothing at all. So I would encourage people to remember it's a learning journey. And that might mean that you might not always get it right, but that shouldn't discourage us from being active with our allyship, rather than these one-off black squares on Instagram. By all means, keep them up, but try to hit this stuff and hit it hard every single day. Approach every business decision as an opportunity to help or hinder equality. That's the level I want people to get at every single day. Not, I don't know, maybe not on Tuesday, can't be bothered. No, we need to all come full force and come full force and ready to work every day. Because the sooner we're all aligned on that, I think the faster we're going to see these wheels of change moving in the direction we want.
Absolutely. And also just to add to that as well, Alyssa, I think that's what an amazing point, honestly. But I think as well, you don't have to, the learning doesn't have to be public, right? So if you're scared of getting it wrong, no one's gonna say, hey, what is this that you're reading? Or what document, just be curious and just learn about, I don't know, and I think this is why I'm so grateful for kind of all these movements and all these social movements that have gone on. And I appreciate this so much, especially with BLM, so much Black labor that's gone into that. And it's, really appreciative of it, because it wasn't for them to educate people on white privilege, and yet they really led the way. But the impact of it has been phenomenal in terms of, people learning, being curious. These Netflix documentaries are all telling people started watching, all these books that people started reading. And so it doesn't have to be public. Your work can be introverted and it can be at home, but everyone has to do work. Yeah.
There are so many ways to learn as well. It doesn't necessarily have to be, let me read an academic book about what sexuality means, but actually, there are so many, if we're talking about LGBT+, for example, there are so many stories out there, even from TV shows like Pose or It's a Sin, had a massive impact in the UK on people learning about things that they just didn't know before. And then of course their curiosity was spiked. And it's so important to just, my one tip was pretty much the same as Alyssa's, but it's to engage in the conversation, to ask the questions. We're all going to get it wrong sometimes. We're all going to come across a new term that we don't quite understand, and maybe we'll use it wrong the first couple of times. That's okay. And maybe someone will say, hey, you used that wrong, you should say this instead. And the natural human reaction when someone tells you you've done something wrong is to put a wall up and be defensive, but just stopping and going, okay, actually this isn't, yes, I've made a mistake, but actually that's just an opportunity to get it right the next time. One thing I always do from a language perspective is I always encourage everyone, try and go a whole day without using any gendered terms. And it wasn't until I did that I realized how many times I made assumptions in my head. without the information. And it had and then I had to go through a whole process of like retraining my brain of how to say certain things. But it was really powerful. And then you can take that in to the work you're doing, ask the questions. If you're at the table and there isn't necessarily an LGBT plus person here, you can still say, okay, how will this come across if a gay person sees this advert or something like that? And maybe the answer will be, oh, we don't know, but that's your opportunity to then start the conversation. It might be difficult, it might be uncomfortable at first, but that's not an excuse not to do it. You can still make a big impact as an ally, whatever you want to call it. And from a budget point, just to address that as well, I think one thing that organizations can do, I talk a lot about the difference between like what can we do as individuals versus what can an organization do, but actually what I'd recommend organizations to do is really empower your employees to have the opportunity to engage in these kind of discussions, in initiatives. You know, many organizations will have an employee network, but often it'll be those people that are involved in it that might be leading the network, but doing it on the side of their full-time job and still have the same expectations of work to complete, and then also they're leading a network on the side. Of course, that takes its toll, and many people will do it because they want to and they care, and that's great. But you can, as an organization, show your employees that you care so much more by actually giving them the space to do this alongside their job within that capacity, or giving them the budget that they need to put on initiatives, to have panels like this. I'm available to do events and celebrations and awareness building and training and all of those things. It again just can make that difference between telling your employees that you care and showing them that you care.
Learning is questioning any sort of existing beliefs that you might have, questioning the relationship to the knowledge that you have and not sort of taking it for granted and taking it as a given. And so when we talk about learning, it's a willingness to change your mind. And I see this, there's going to be a reluctance when you've gotten to a certain stage in your life and, you know, you're really established and you're really successful and you've got all these degrees. You're not at a stage where your knowledge is being questioned very often. But, you know, we're all back in school, right? Because like Jack said, we've all made mistakes. I've accidentally misgendered people before. I've definitely like clocked my own anti-blackness in certain things I've said and done before. And it's just, it's ongoing and it's fine. And this is what we have to do, and like treat the learning like you treat the language, like you treat the social categories. These are all things that are meant to be fluid and that change over time. Part of the problem that we're having with all of these forms of discrimination is holding on to fixed ideas over fixed categories, and sort of like easing that up a little bit definitely helps. So that's always step one. It's the sitting with yourself, educating, learning, and then bringing that into an institutional level. Okay, what kind of training do we have? Why isn't the training not mandatory? Who are the trainers that we're bringing in to do this work? Are they just like making us feel better about ourselves, or are they really questioning some of our practices and like, you know, making us do something a bit different? That being said, you also need to sort of start collecting information from the people within your own company. And this is also a fine line, because you also don't want to put the burden of all the work on marginalized people, but at the same time, you want to hear the voices of the people in your company, because keep in mind, being a person of color is not the same experience everywhere. It's not the same in your home as it is in the street, as it is in this particular workplace. So it's important to find out how being from a particular minority affects your experience within your company. That being said, out of my own experience as well, I don't have diversity and inclusion in my job title. It is not in my job description. And so how you end up treating the people, because most of the time, these are the people that will voluntarily take up the work themselves, like Jack said, leading a network or whatever. How you treat those people in your company is also very telling. So it's not just going and spending thousands of pounds on like external consultants, but then when you do see people in the workplace doing this, it's like, I appreciate you, I respect, like, and I've been in situations where the language will sort of get turned around and make it sound like they're doing me a favor by letting me come to a meeting or like giving my opinion. I'm like, I'm sorry, so you're gonna do me a favor by my helping you diversify your company? This is again the thing that's like, we need to fix this. And because it's like, I'm not super senior, my opinion and knowledge is not considered as valuable as the CEO's. But if you're a straight white man, I don't care how long you've been in a CEO, you cannot come and tell me what it's like to be me. And so we need to completely get rid of these ideas that like the hierarchies of knowledge and expertise in a company, when it comes to diversity and inclusion work, throw it out. It's going to be a whole different system of knowledge and work that's being done, and budgets are ideological. So if you're not investing in something, you're not serious about it. And I think that applies to any aspect of any business. And the final thing I want to say is that whenever you come across a feeling of like defensiveness or shame or guilt, understand that these feelings are usually very individual, and the words that we've been saying in this panel over and over again are collective and social. It's not about you. And shame and guilt is a very personal feeling. And again, remember, bigger picture, who we're doing this for. It's the majority at the end of the day, global majority at least. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I think that's actually a perfect way to end the discussion. So I think we'll leave it here unless anybody else wants to add anything. But I'm super grateful. Every single one of you being on this panel, honestly, so happy. And,